My dad was a logger in Upper Tennessee for the last 30 years of his life. I worked at a sawmill and only did logging when the old man needed help finishing up a contract on time. He worked on government land, which meant he worked in the national forest around here. Logging suited me just fine, but the pay wasn't regular. You have to bid and win those contracts. Then you hope like hell nothing goes wrong with your equipment and none of the people working for you get hurt, or just plain don't show up. Getting sick and missing work was just out of the question for my dad though, and until I took over his business, I never understood how and why he would drag himself out of bed and go into the woods before the sun was even up when he was sick as a mule. I took over the business when the old man died a few years ago. My wife and I had divorced, and the kids were all grown, so I didn't have much reason to stick with the sawmill job that offered a steady paycheck, but made me miserable for 6 days a week. I won't lie, I had the stupidest grin on my face when I won my first job. I was going to be working just a few miles from home. My brother and nephews were going to work with me, and I thought I was going to make my family's fortune in logging. Don't judge. I was still young enough to have high hopes, and thank you very much, the world has corrected the course of my life accordingly. And now I'm just a sour, grouchy, glasses half full kind of guy. But a few years ago, man, I thought I was all that in a bag of chips. Sure, I was getting a late start for someone trying to build a family fortune, but I was sure I still had enough life and gumption to do it. Now, of course, when you're logging in an area, you have to leave your equipment back in the woods, usually up on a mountain. Some people had burned one of my dad's pieces of equipment, took the tires off of his truck, and even stole his logging chains about 15 years ago. So it was a fast rule that we never left the equipment unmanned overnight. We had a small pull-up behind camper and one of us stayed in it every night. Even with the schedule made that listed every one of us and our nights to stay, I usually ended up staying. I didn't really mind most of the time. I was the only one who no longer had family waiting at home. And to be honest, I kind of got used to the peace, the solitude, and the darkness. Man-made lighting is overrated. There's something to be said about living so close to the natural rhythm of the world. Now I'd like to sit here and write that I built a fire every night for cooking, light, and heat, but I can't. None if I'm going to be honest anyway. Most of the places we worked, open fires weren't allowed because of the risk of wildfires. So I used the electric lights, the stove, and when necessary, the heater in the camper. We worked in some places where there was a lot of space, and we worked in some places that were so densely forested that you couldn't walk 5 feet in any direction without hitting a tree. Those thick, dense places, they were my favorite. It made you work harder, and it was sometimes a little bit more dangerous, but I liked it. And one of those places, in the end, is what caused me to make up my mind to turn trail and run out of the woods, and not to go back. Now this happened a few summers back. I'm not going to say how many summers, and I'm only going to give a general idea because some of you are from around here, and you'll know who I am and the incident I'm talking about if you're over the right age. And no, I'm not going to say what the right age is either. If you live in Tennessee and you know anything about the Devil's Looking Glass, Bumpus Cove, and yeah, that's the new spelling. It used to be Bump Pass, because we all laughed and called it Bump Ass Cove. I guess some official or someone other caught on to the joke and changed the spelling to Bump Us Cove. Or maybe because there's a town in Virginia spelled Bump Ass, and they didn't like that it was being confused. But now that that's cleared up, A few summers back, me and the boys had put in a long, hard day clearing enough of the tree off a new contract lot somewhere in the general vicinity of the Devil's Looking Glass. Joe had cut his hand while pulling cable, and it was his turn to stay with the equipment. I sent him on down to the hospital because I figured he'd need stitches, and I volunteered to stay that night. It was silent and still, except for the insects that night. Nothing unusual for the first few days on site. The wildlife is fast to exit stage left and slow to return. And as for people, well, the site was a bit out of the way. There were no trails leading to it, and there was a government gate way down the mountain where we came and we went. My brother had the key to the gate so he and the boys could get back in the next morning. By the time we were on that job, I had figured out there was money in the logging business, but not enough to make me and my family rich. We did all right for ourselves, though, but I was bummed out that night. With Joe getting hurt, he wouldn't be good for much until his hand healed, so we would be one worker short. Not a good way to start a new job, especially not a big job that was going to push us to finish in time anyway. After supper, I went outside and I sat on a stump a few feet from the camper. The air had cooled, and there was a nice gentle breeze. The sun had gone down far enough that I couldn't see it anymore, but there was a deep crimson glow off in the west, and I watched the world fall into darkness as I drank the last of my coffee. I turned on the LED lantern and dialed it down to almost the dimmest setting. And then I closed my eyes and listened to the crickets, the tree frogs, and the jar flies. I know a lot of people don't care for those sounds. They call them noises, but hell, I happen to enjoy it. It's a hell of a lot better than relaxing to the ambient sounds of vehicles, sirens, stupid commercials on TV, or the neighbors arguing for the third time that day. 20 minutes into my own special mountain man meditation session, the wind shifted directions, and with that shift, a new smell hit me and knocked me right out of the relaxed state I was in. My eyes flew wide. The fine hairs on the top of my arms, they stood up, and my gut tightened. I couldn't place the smell, but it shouldn't have been there. I was supposed to be alone, and it wasn't the odor of bear or any other natural wild animal. There was an undernote of cedar and something else. Something that made it seem almost like musky men's cologne, but not quite. I cranked the LED up brighter and I held it out in front of me as I moved toward the camper. 3 steps, and the jar flies went silent. Then the crickets and the tree frogs followed suit. I felt eyes on me from the darkness, beyond the bright white from the lantern, but I couldn't tell in what direction. It was a pervasive feeling of being watched from all sides. Sweat beaded on my forehead and face. My throat tightened. Adrenaline pumped. Every tiny sound was like an elephant stomping around. Every scent was strong enough to make me wince. And then there was something else. Something harder to explain. But there was an energy in the air, like the air itself was electrically charged. That's the best I can explain it. If you've ever been outside just before a bad lightning storm, well, hell, you kind of get the idea, but there was a feeling of dread with it too. I left the lantern a couple steps from the front of the camper. I went inside and I shut the door. I made a mental note to pick up a few more of the lanterns next time I was in town. It would be better to have a few I could hang around the outside of the camper at night. At least I'd be able to see more than a wall of black when I looked out the tiny windows. About the time I convinced myself that I had imagined that weird, dirty, cologne-like smell, something bumped against the back wall, and the whole camper rocked. My first thought was a bear. It smelled my supper and maybe came to check it out. We mostly have black bears around here, And most people think the curious smaller bear is cute and gentle, but trust me, they could be deadly. Granted, most of the time, they're easily scared off, but if one is hungry enough to come knocking at the camper for some supper, he might be more dangerous than I wanted to deal with. And of course, he was at the back of the camper where I couldn't get a good look at him. I had a rifle and a shotgun for protection, but I didn't want to shoot unless he made a more aggressive move. He couldn't get through the window, and I didn't think he could get through the wall either, but if he made his way around to the front where the door was, I would have to shoot. My mind raced, and I remembered that I had brought Nutter Butter cookies with me. They were in Ziploc baggies in a tin. I'd put the tin in the cabinet over the bed, and I didn't have any supper left, but I had those cookies. I grabbed the tin and the bear rocked the camper again. The baggie hit the floor. I tossed the tin and the lid, and they clattered against the floor, and the bear growled. It was a deep guttural sound unlike any bear I'd ever heard before. And with the baggie in one hand, I froze. Was it a bear? I listened for another minute or two and heard no more growling. Maybe the sound of the tin scared it off. I stepped to the door and looked through the window. There was no animal, but my coffee cup sat right beside the lantern, like I'd placed it there on purpose. But I hadn't. The coffee cup should have been laying over by the stump. I knew I hadn't put it beside the lantern, but how did it get there? A bear might have batted it around or stuck its nose in the cup, but it wouldn't have carried it and placed it by the light like that. Now, logically, a person would not have been out there, not with whatever animal had growled only a minute or two before. If a person had been out there, that animal would have gone after them, and I would have heard the commotion and the screams. That was the first time in my life I was so scared I couldn't move, and I didn't know what to do next. I stood there staring at that stupid cup for at least 5 minutes before something shuffled at the front end of the camper, ran toward the truck, and then I heard the springs of the truck squeak in protest as something heavy got on top of it. I darted to the window in that end and jerked the curtain back. There was enough dim light from the lantern that the side of the old beater Ford was visible, and almost enough light for me to see in the bed of it. The light reflected off the back window of the truck, and something blocked that reflection. It was on 2 legs, and it looked like it had arms with hands. It was not an animal, but it wasn't human. Squinting, I pressed closer to the window and I held my breath. The few feet between me and the thing in the bed of my truck might as well have been the Grand Canyon for all the detail I could see. The darkness was just too thick. Its hand had been over the side of the truck, as if it had been using it to keep balance. I was sure I had seen a human arm and hand that was just a little too long to be normal. Without warning, the bed of the truck moved, and again, the camper moved. Whatever had been in the truck was out. I followed the sound of its walking to the other end of the camper. Every instinct was telling me to shoot first and ask questions later. If it would have moved just a little more to the light, maybe I would have, but I didn't. It growled close to the window. Then it ran toward the thick woods on the other side of the logging road. Now, about an hour later, I heard a deer screaming in that same direction. I had never wanted to get out of a place so bad, but there was no driving out. My brother had locked the gate, and he took the key with him. There was no way in hell I was going to try my luck walking out. I did think about driving to the gate and then getting out to run past it, but that thought was laughable and lasted about as long as the dying deer's scream had. I was stuck right and proper until the next morning. Now that was about 2 a.m. My brother would show up around 5:30 or 6 with his boys in tow. That thought comforted me for a couple of hours. And then I thought about one of them getting out to unlock that damn gate. It would likely still be dark. That thing was out there somewhere. And what if? And before you go harping on about why I didn't use my cell phone, there's no signal back there. None. The only thing I had on me was the AM/FM radio, and since I'm not MacGyver or a member of the A-Team, I had no way of getting a hold of anyone. The lantern still burned outside, but it had dimmed a little. The batteries wouldn't last until sunrise. I stood at the door staring through the little window. If I was going to do anything, I had to do it soon. My flashlight was in the truck. My keys were in my pocket, but the driver door of the truck was about 20 feet away. Out there, where the thing was. I told myself it had to have been a bear, but that didn't do any good. Even an idiot knows when they see a bear. Bears have legs and paws. It's just a biological fact. Moving from window to window, I kept trying to see where I knew I couldn't. I listened and heard nothing but the insects. The whole time that thing had been outside, I hadn't noticed any noises in the forest, except for the noise that it had made. Since the insects were singing again, I quietly opened the door just a crack, and I looked toward the truck. I couldn't get out of the woods with it, but I could get to the gate before my brother and nephews got there. I could warn them to stay in their truck until the sun came up, and we could see if that thing was anywhere around. I would just tell them it was a bear that was acting weird and trying to get into the camper. They'd never believed the truth. And so, screwing up my courage, I opened the door a little more and stuck my head out. The insects continued to sing. The air smelled of the previous day's fresh-cut timber, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Creature was gone, for the time being. I gripped the Ford's door key in my hand, and I pushed the door wider, ready to yank it shut again at the first hint that the creature was back. But there was nothing. I let out a long breath and smiled with relief. Maybe the deer had satisfied its hunger, or its need to kill, or whatever. It wasn't near me at that moment, and that's all I cared about. After another minute of braving up, I finally stepped outside the camper and eased the door shut. The soft click was terrifying. What if the thing was waiting around the corner for me to shut that door? Would the extra 2 seconds it took to open again cost me my life? And so, with the rifle under my arm, I stepped over and I grabbed the lantern and then hurried toward the truck, trying to be as quiet as I could. I didn't want to draw the thing's attention if it was still sitting in the woods. Put the key to the door, but was holding it upside down. Cursing under my breath, I turned it over and pushed it into lock. The keys on the rings dangled and clanged against the metal. I sucked in a sharp breath as all the insects went silent again. It's just me, it was just me. The noise I made, I said in a low voice as I turned the key. When I pulled it out of the lock, the whole ring slipped out of my grasp. Hell. I went to pick him up, and the barrel of the gun whacked that damned door. The sound echoed sharply through the silence. I stepped back and let the lantern fall as I grabbed the gun with one hand, and then I picked the keys up with another. But then something growled across the road, and my heart nearly exploded. I yanked the door open, I tossed the gun in, and I jumped in myself. I hit the lock with my left elbow while I jammed the key in the ignition. The engine grumbled to life as the headlights washed the world white in front of me. And there it stood, 7 feet tall and humanoid-shaped, with dark fur covering it from head to toe. It shielded its eyes from the brightness of the headlights, and it screamed. The sound was almost human. Could have been mistaken for human if I hadn't been looking right at the thing. The almost human hand was tipped with long black claws that curled downward. It dropped its arm. The face was that of a short-snouted dog, and the eyes reflected red. That was the second time I'd ever been paralyzed with fear. It wasn't a trend I didn't like and I didn't need, but I couldn't move anything but my eyes. I realized that the starter was grinding, and I told my hand to release the key, but it took several seconds for it to happen. My foot was on the accelerator, and the engine sounded like it was getting ready to blow. I had to get control of myself. The creature laid back its ears, turned to face me, leaned forward, and screamed over the hood of my truck. Fury burned in its eyes. When it screamed, I screamed. Before I could get my body to obey my brain's commands, the thing was on the hood and thrashing at the windshield. It hung on after I got the old Ford moving, too. Hell, I think I screamed for the first 5 minutes of the drive. I screamed until there was no more screams left in me. The terror was replaced with determination. At the foot of the mountain where the gate was, I could probably get enough cell reception to call my brother and warn him. He would have his rifle. He could shoot the thing off my truck without getting out of his. I took a sharp turn too fast, and the camper caught in a deep rut. When it tipped up on one side, the force yanked the truck. The creature fell off and yelped, and I laughed a little. I laughed until I realized that I couldn't drive fast enough on that rutted, narrow road to outpace the monster. I heard its claws rip into the camper, heard it move toward the truck, and almost shit my pants when it hit the window right behind my head. It thrashed and clawed at the window, and I laughed when I realized that it couldn't break through the thick glass. A chill went up my spine and my skin shrunk 2 sizes as I heard the distinct sound of a cinder block scraping across the bed of the truck. All I could do was brace and cover my head for what I knew was coming next. The impact shattered the glass and it pelted against me. I didn't freeze that time, though. I think all my panic had left when the screams ran out earlier. I slammed the shifter into park, and a heavy furry mass hit me from behind, teeth snapping at my right ear, but I had the door open and was out before its body thudded into the seat. I slammed the door as hard as I could, and the thing yelped again as the door hit it in the face. I ran for the camper. It was the only place I could go. The horrible sounds of the creature clawing out that busted back window caused a terror I couldn't even begin to explain. And as it leaped from the bed of the truck, I opened the door. It was on my heels. It swiped at my back, shredding my shirt, and then I was inside, but my hand was still on the door. And that's how it bit me. The pain was like a dozen hornets stinging. I found my ability to scream again, and I also realized that in that moment, I would go down fighting. I shouldered the door into the monster, and its teeth ripped out of my hand. The warm gush of blood was sickening, but I would take that over the alternative any day. Jerking my hand inside, and stumbled to the table where I propped long enough to wrap my hand in my shirt. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't have time to. I had to call my brother and warn him. But it didn't do any good to warn him. When he heard my voice, he said he knew I was injured, and there was no way he was just going to play it safe and let me stay there until the coast was clear. He drove to where I was. His son had his rifle out the window, but they said that they saw nothing all the way up to where I was. I told him it was a bear, and I never wavered from the story. Not when he and his sons questioned all the damage done to the truck and camper. Not when the doctors were making their reports. And for sure, not when the forest ranger and cops were questioning me for their reports. So, you might be wondering why I'm telling the truth here. I started not to tell this story. I mean, it's been a few years and I've been fine. Healthier than ever, actually. And I had almost convinced myself that I really had just seen a bear that had somehow been provoked to violence. Almost. You see, last week, I had a nightmare. 3 nights in a row, mind you. I was running from something in the dark woods. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it screaming and growling behind me. I woke up all covered in sweat, my heart racing, my bones aching. On the 4th day, my clothes didn't fit exactly right anymore. They were just a little too small, just about everywhere. On the 5th day, I bumped my head on the shower curtain bar as I got out. And now, today, there's dark fur covering the bald spot on the top of my head, and I smelled like I rolled in that stinky cologne with undertones of cedar. See, I'm afraid that tomorrow I won't be able to tell you my story. I already have a craving for raw meat and an all-consuming need to go run through the woods under the full moon.